Hello. Oh, good. This is live. Excellent. I got to admit, the intro made everything sound so much better than I intended, but all right. So yes, first of all, thank you all for having me back here again. I really do appreciate the opportunity to any time to come back to Ireland. I am always a big fan of that. And especially, thank you to Rick. One of the things I want to start off with right away is I was going to save this at the end, but I'm going to save it right now because he just got off stage. One, we both have the same clothing designer. The other thing too is I want to say thanks to Rick because when the war broke out in Ukraine, one of the things that our team was doing at Cisco was helping to exfil people out of Ukraine that worked for the company. And one family we were having trouble getting across the border, and Rick was good enough to help us get them across the border into Poland and helped us try and secure housing for them. So I just wanted to say a very public thank you to Rick. All right, so let's crash right in here. So I have been doing security in one form or another for far too long. And along the ways, I've started trying to find different ways to do things. And I've got myself involved in a whiskey distillery. I've got myself involved in a football club and things like that. Not as a player. And it's been very interesting to try and move beyond that because for a long time, I identified as a hacker and that was my raison d'etre. But I realized it's like linking that to the job is really not a good thing, but that's another conversation for another time. Because I tend to feel like this whenever I travel. I have been traveling now for 12 years straight at about 250,000 kilometers per year. I am running out of gas. But I am Canadian, and we tend to look at hacking a little bit differently in Canada. It tends to be a little bit more violent, but that's another thing. So I tend to have a lot of issues because before I ever got into the vendor space, I spent 20 years as 20 years as a defender. And a lot of what Rick was talking about earlier is spot on. I spent 9 of those years in control systems. And it's absolutely staggering how many things can and do go wrong on a literal basis. And the whole idea of the talk today is really about talking about topical things like operational technology, 5G, AI, but it's not a buzzword bingo kind of thing. If you had the card, you had already filled it by now. The whole idea here is to get people to start thinking about this at a much more strategic level. Because I remember when cloud first became the big thing. And it was so maddening because at one RSA conference, I was standing there in front of a booth and it was cloud something. I can't even remember the vendor's name, but I said, okay, great. You have an appliance. Cloud. Okay. So what is it about your company that does cloud? And finally, after having a good 10 minutes of going back and forth, they finally said, look, we just put it there so VCs would fund us. And this is the kind of thing we have to worry about. We have to make sure that we are looking at things in a much more in-depth kind of conversation as opposed to, the buzzword bingo approach. So one of the things that we have to look at is what is a threat. So sharks elicit a very visceral reaction for most people. They see it as a threat. But based on data, they are good for about 5 deaths in the human population per annum. Now, by contrast, cows are good for 22 deaths per year. And yes, it was pointed out to me at one point that there is a statistical sampling issue here in that there are more cows than sharks, but thank you for ruining the joke to that person. So my boss, Wendy Nather, is awesome. But she likes to make my life miserable sometimes. So at one point she was coming back from a conference and she sent me this picture from the plane. And she said, tell me where you are. I said, boss, I got work to do. She goes, come on, do it. All right, fine. So you can't quite see it in this picture, but over to the one side, I could see the tip of the wing. So I knew 1, she was coming back from Europe. 2, I knew what conference she was speaking at. And 3, I knew her favorite airline, all of which were publicly available information bits. And I said, okay, let's go. So after pulling all the information together based on time of day, where the light was on the window, assuming that the picture was sent to me roughly in real time, I said, is this your flight? And she said, yes. Well done. Now tell me what seat I'm sitting in. Great. So pull up the flight manifest, and I said, okay, let's go for it. Looking down here, based on the trajectory, where the sun was, where the wingtip was, I said, okay, you are in seat 5A. She came back and she said, actually, no, I'm in seat 6A. And I was great, fantastic. I was so close. The crazy thing here is all of this took place in less than 5 minutes. And I love using this story because it's very analogous when I'm talking to organizations about how easy it is for an attacker to gain information, collect information about your organization. Rick earlier was talking about how there was 8 different pieces of malware specifically for control systems. The reason that really sort of resonates with me is because a lot of these systems are built using traditional operating systems. A lot of it's based on Windows. That might be a shocker for a lot of people. So a lot of times they just go after the underlying operating system as opposed to targeting the software directly. And then we have to worry about, once we put in all the tools, we have to worry about Dave. Because Dave is always going to find a way to break everything. And not me, but, well, on occasion. And I tend to be this guy far too often. And I find myself yelling at various different types of technology because I see a repetitive behavior throughout the industry. At one point, everybody was chasing cloud. Now everybody's chasing AI. ChatGPT, I'll give it full props, is a catalytic event. It's got everybody talking. But that's about the extent of it. We have to look at things in a much more sensible approach. Now, at one point in time, we would look at things from an attacker perspective of, how are we going to improve our networks? Well, this site came out back in 2015. This is called the Hackers List. Oddly enough, it's still around today. Within 48 hours of this site going live, it had actually been hacked. So I enjoy this analogy. And that's not to beat up on them, it's just to show that it could happen to anyone. And nowadays we have all sorts of different bug bounty programs, and I will not be the person to talk about these because that's not my forte, but it just shows that I was 10 years too late with my security research because I found all sorts of CVEs, and unfortunately it was well before any of this was a thing. One particular company threatened to sue me into oblivion, but that's another story for another time. So as defenders, we have to constantly be worried about all these sort of adversaries. A lot of times what I'm finding is it's bored kids. And one of the things that I've gone out of my way to do is sit my kids down and talk to them about what computer security is. And the really amazing thing was my son had his friends over and they were having a little LAN party at the house and he was teaching them about security. And that's just it. One of those things where security awareness works. And he was able to communicate that across. Because if you don't do that, then you get your bored teens. And bored teens tend to get themselves into trouble with the law. They are rather of a pesky sort of attacker, but that is one of the things that we have to contend with. And they really do make bad decisions. Then you have your hacktivists, as was outlined earlier. They will come and go. They are motivated by whatever happens to be the flavor of the day. Then we have to worry about the various nation states and how they are going to approach things with respect to your organization. Sorry, let me just collect myself there. Yeah, I wasn't as smart as Rick. I got in early. And then we have to deal with our standard villains that are looking at, collecting money because there's a huge, there's a lot of profit to be made. I remember earlier on in my career with reflection mirrors like Aldas, Zone H, Attrition, all those things, people would hack a website and load it up and say, greets to all my friends. Now it's big business. And these are some of the tools they used to use. And I enjoyed talking about these at one point in time because Havage, which was a SQL injection tool, it still works. It still works. We have had SQL injection on the OWASP top 10 for how long? Can anybody tell me? You didn't know there was an interactive portion. 25 years? Close enough. Since pretty much the beginning. And that's the crazy thing. Why do these still work? We have to do better. And when we jump forward in time and we look at stuff like the Mirai botnet, this was one of the things that absolutely drove me to distraction. Why? Because of this. It was using default credentials that were hard-coded in the systems. Now, we heard about control systems earlier and about how they were being targeted by various types of attackers. The crazy thing is, if you know where to look, you can download the manuals for these control systems, and guess what's in the manuals? The default credentials. Otter tail. There's a spoiler alert. There can be only one approach to this. We have to make sure that we are doing better collectively. So, where do we go? Well, we're looking at a slide that does not present properly. Wow. I can't even read that. All right, so we're dealing with operational technology, which is dealing with critical infrastructure, be it electricity and water, whatever that happens to be along those lines. We're looking at 5G now as a way that all of these things can be tied together. One thing we have to be very cognizant of is that requires a lot more hardware. And AI, the wonderful if-then-else statement that everybody likes to deal with. I don't know what happened to my slides here. What was that? Yeah. All right. I will try and crib off. Yeah, okay. So 5G being a wireless network that is communication with mobile devices, but is being used a lot with critical infrastructure as well. In Ontario, Canada, we had a smart metering network when I was working in control systems that was, millions of nodes, and all of these nodes were using 3G at the time. And it was amazing. You have any sort of latency, any sort of drift that would negatively impact the power system. And now with 5G, that's going to improve things, but it's also going to give the attackers the opportunity as well. Because if you were at Black Hat back in, 2009, I believe it was, there was a presentation there where somebody was able to flash the firmware on a smart meter that would then propagate to other smart meters and create its own botnet. And it was absolutely stunning. Now imagine that with 5G. Things could get really quickly. Okay. Unraveling OT. So when we're talking about, and then this slide is fine. I don't get it. All right. So with operational technology, when I spent all that time in this space, it was absolutely staggering how many times things would go wrong. At one point, I had a pen testing team come in and start doing work for us. And guess what? Flat network. Heard that earlier. When they started scanning systems to do their assessment, they scanned what part of the HMI, where it controls the SCADA systems. What happened was when it hit a half-open connection on a Lock D daemon, it caused a cascade failure, which almost knocked out the power for the northeast of North America. That was just an Nmap scan, just scanning devices, and it could have knocked everything out. So when we hear about things like, targeted attacks and things like that, a lot of this is very fragile to start with, and hopefully this is going to improve going forward. And when we're talking about operational technology, oh my gosh, I do apologize. My slides are not usually this messed up. All right, I'll skip past that one. All right, so when we're looking at protecting these systems, we have to look at very much in the same way we look at dealing with IT systems. OT systems really do use a lot of the exact same software. And the problem is you have two different camps, OT versus IT, which is engineering versus the IT nerds. And having been an IT nerd, I know what that battle was like because the engineering teams never wanted to play nice. And they would always tell us we didn't understand their systems. I'm like, well, we built them and delivered them to you. And it's amazing to see as we're going through and looking at all these different types of things, we have to make sure that we are not doing silly things. Like, for example, the line at the bottom there, we're dealing with a control system operator in Southeast Asia. This was quite a few years ago. They didn't want to have to VPN into their systems on the weekend. So what did they do? They sent all of their status messages to a Twitter account. So you could actually see all of the SCADA system on Twitter. And we had to have a nice little conversation. A few of our friends dialed them up and said, look, this is a really bad idea. And they're like, why? And this was one of those things. They did not have the ability to understand because they were not security folks. They were very good at keeping the lights on, but they didn't understand the implications of what could have happened there. So when we're talking about the convergence of all of these things, bringing them all together, we have to understand that this is a strategic conversation. We want to make sure that we're not just bolting things on or just chasing the next acronym, whatever it happens to be. Because all of these things, when you bring them all together, yes, it gives us all sorts of opportunities, but it also gives opportunities for the attackers as well. So AI, this is the initial fear that everybody has, and it's really funny because I can't believe this is still the reference point that I get from so many people. I'll be talking to, family, friends, customers. This, at some point, always comes up. So we have to talk about AI in a sensible approach. AI is really good at improving things. It is really good at helping you to improve the operations of your systems. When you're talking about IT systems and OT systems, all the learning, you want to have the ability from a technological perspective to go through and look at all these things as quickly as you can because, as Rick was talking about earlier, trying to identify everybody in the stadium is really not plausible. So you do need these systems to help. The problem here is you could introduce algorithmic bias. Because algorithms are written by people, so people have their biases. You may not think you have them, but you do. Whatever they happen to be, they are yours. Negative or positive, they still have that potential. And the problem is with all of these things, you have the issue where it could lead to privacy breaches, especially when you have autonomous systems that are making decisions without humans. You have to have the ability to have human interaction to make sure you can step in and say, okay, there is something very wrong here. And 5G really does allow for this to speed up. Now, the problem with 5G is there's quite a few risks. With 5G, you have supply chain threats of all the systems that you have to contend with, because when you are deploying a 5G network, there is a greater level of density that's required. You have to have this shorter distances between towers, which means more equipment, more targets of opportunity, more potential for things to go wrong. That gives you that increased attack surface. And from a physical infrastructure perspective, when I was working for a power company in Ontario, Canada, we had this incident where we discovered there was a single power pole in Ontario that if we took a large pickup truck and a chain, tied it to it, and drove off, we'd actually knock out power for the entire province. We were able to remedy that, but it was absolutely staggering that we were able to puzzle that out. We have to worry about all the endpoints. We have to worry about the lack of standardized security protocols in that space, and good old misconfigurations. I've made a few mistakes myself. It happens. But we have to make sure that we're being very diligent. Now, when we're dealing with cybersecurity from that perspective, we have to worry about the hackers. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, because I've always used that term. Unfortunately, the media has vilified the term hackers, and we have to take it back. I don't know if we'll ever get it back, but it's one of those things we have to look into. We have to find ways that we can take that trust fall and be able to have the conversation with other groups. We have to stop operating in silos. One of the biggest problems I have is security overall is we're very good at looking at the lint in our belly buttons. We need to be better at talking to other organizations. We need to go beyond that. There are some folks in here that have done a lot of amazing policy work. Hi, Jen. Oh, and Katie's there too. And we have to make sure that we are getting this wider message out. Like, we are here doing security. We have a noble purpose. It's not just all doom and gloom. We have to make sure that we are getting the message across to that wider audience. And there's regulatory frameworks that are helping to build this out. There's different types of AI bits that are coming out. We have in Canada, the EU, as well as the United States, but there are parts of the world where there is nothing. In Singapore, they don't have anything currently. And that's just one of many examples. And that's not to beat them up. It's just this is really, really new. And people are scrambling to get ahead of this. And it really is amazing where AI is now popping up. It is popping up in pretty much every conceivable aspect of industry today. And the last line is invisible. These are the weirdest slides I've ever done. Anyway, so the last line is talking about legal precedent and, oh wait, okay. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, so the last line really gets me because this is a great example where a lawyer actually used ChatGPT to write a legal brief, and good old ChatGPT, what did it do? It made stuff up. So this brief was submitted. The judge chastised the lawyer because the references that were made didn't exist. So you got to be sure that the tools you're using are the right tools. Now, as an LLM, it's really interesting. I use it a lot for doing, meal planning for the family, which is quite good at. But you have to make sure that if you're using this for critical items, things can and will go wrong. For example, if you have meeting minutes that you want to distill down and then distribute it within your company, don't load them into ChatGPT thinking everything will be fine. One company that will remain nameless did exactly this. And guess what? Other operators that were using ChatGPT could see their data. I'll let that breathe for a second. AI really shows up all over the place, even when you order a pizza. A lot of platforms now are using artificial intelligence in order to get things done. So when we're talking about AI, it really tends to get muddled, very much like cloud was years ago. Everybody would just say, oh, it's just cloud. It's just, magical IT dust. But we have to look at it growing right down to generative AI, deep learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the different layers. We have to understand what we're dealing with. We have to look at it too, as well as people understanding what are the four axes. And systems have to be able to think rationally, act humanly, and act rationally. I haven't seen any system get to this point yet, although I've heard rumors and stories, but I'm sure at some point we'll get to that point. Turing tests are fun. And when we have to have this conversation as to what a true AI is, these are the four key components here that we have to look at. Natural language inputs, knowledge representation, automated reasoning, and machine learning in order to build out new patterns. So these are the four stages that need to be mastered in order for a system to deal with an AI, be called an AI. And when we're looking at all these things, and again, part of my slide's munged, so I'll just skip that one. The one key piece here is that when we're looking at all these AI systems, you need lots of training data, computational power, and a lot of human input. That's the part that tends to get overlooked a lot in the conversations that I have. And we want to make sure that people understand that none of these AI systems are going to work properly unless we can give them proper requirements. And anybody in IT can say, how has anybody ever got good requirements from their customer? Not a soul. So Mikko, he really got me a few years back when we were at a conference in Stockholm when he talked about applications writing applications. This is quite a few years ago. And this really got to me because I thought about, at one point, if one application went bad and started writing all sorts of other bad applications, this could really have quite a significant impact. And then we jump forward and we think, okay, what about AI? And well, now we have things like Worm GPT or Fraud GPT as well. The attackers are now leveraging ChatGPT to do bad things. Anybody surprised? No. This is just it. The attackers are going to leverage the same tools you're going to do in order to launch attacks and try to gain access into your organization. And we have to be very cognizant of that. We have to understand the threats that are laid against us. Also, we have to be very transparent about our information that we're using. If you are generating content, are you using an AI or are you using, fingers on keyboards? So when ChatGPT 3.5 came out, one of the things I got it to do was write 47 blog posts. Why 47? Because I got bored at that point. That was the end of it. However, in every one of these blog posts, there was a tell. And I was like, oh, it's in every single one of them. I copied, pasted, threw it into Google. I found many, many different vendors out there that were using it to write their blog posts. That is really disingenuous. We have to make sure that we're getting away from that. Also, we have to make sure that when we're generating content, it's not using illegal content. For example, Sarah Silverman has launched a suit against OpenAI because they trained their models with copyrighted material. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen to our organizations because these are the kind of conversations that are going to start coming up. So, some of the best practices. Well, I do apologize for these munged up slides. I'm really not sure what happened. Anyway, you want to make sure you have regular employee and awareness training. As weird as that sounds, all of these things come back to core fundamentals. I've been doing security now for over 30 years. I hate that I can say that out loud. And guess what hasn't changed in 30 years? The same damn conversation about access control, network segmentation, all of these different components. And it's really frustrating. We want to make sure we're having strong access control measures because passwords have been a reactive, knee-jerk thing since 1962. They're not a security control. They are a control, but they're not security. It's like a house key. If you lose a house key and somebody gets it and gets into your house, well, then you got a problem because the house doesn't know how to verify who's coming through the front door. You also have to have active user monitoring. You want to look at not just the users, but as well as the technology. Sorry, Tom. And you want to make sure that you have proper data loss prevention technologies. And one of the things that people don't talk about enough is defined repeatable processes. You can buy all the widgets and whatever and plug them into your network, but if you don't have the defined repeatable processes, bad things can and will happen. You want to be able to look at how the user and entities are operating within your organization. And this is more important now as we're talking about AI. As you're introducing it into your environment, you have to know what it's doing. Because if somebody puts a semicolon instead of a comma at some point, well, you're going to have some serious problems. You want to make sure that you have good log management as well as XDR in order to make sure that in the event that your systems are compromised, you are able to shorten the runway that is necessary in order to protect your systems, in order to remediate what's going on in your environment. You want to make sure that you are not having unauthorized data transfers, either uploading data in order to have it as a training model that, I don't know, happens to be production data, never seen that before. Or, like one organization I was at, we had a data transfer that would happen every Friday at 8 a.m. And I looked at it and I said, okay, that's interesting. It's going to an IP in Shenzhen, China. I was like, all right, we have operations in China, and looked into it. Wasn't our IP address, wasn't our building, was nothing that we controlled on the other end. Can anybody guess how long this data transfer had been going on before I found it? Sorry? 3 years was a guess over here. 8. 8 years of rather significant data. I won't tell what kind of data, but damn. And when you're looking at it from an AI perspective, this could happen very quickly. And it's not to say there's something bad with AI, but it's like if a mistake is going to happen, it's going to happen at a much quicker rate. You want to make sure that you have slides that you can read. And you want to look at your data loss prevention slides. It's amazing. These were working yesterday. You want to make sure that you have multi-factor authentication because passwords, they stink. You want to make sure you have good user design and interface design. And what I mean by that is if you give tools written by engineers, for people in finance, for people in HR, whatever it happens to be, you're going to have a very bad day because you want to make their lives as easy as possible. We want to make security seamless. We want to make it simple for people to be secure and not have to worry about how to configure things. All the little bits that you need to throw in there. So responses. You want to figure out how are you going to detect and how are you going to isolate in the event that something happens in your environment and AI is involved. Or it's affecting operational technology where people could die. What are your investigation procedures and how are you baking in these new paradigms to make sure that you are able to respond? You want to be able to coordinate with your legal teams in HR, because when it hits the fan, who are you going to call? And I was on a panel a while back when people said, oh, I'd call my head of security. Oh, I'd call this response team. And I said, I would call the lawyer if something happened, because you would have to have a defined, repeatable process that you'd worked out in advance, hopefully, and then you could go through and figure out what to do next. And then when you're doing that, you want to make sure you have a communication strategy, because when things go bad, and they will, you want to make sure that you're ready. So if you have stockholders, if you have internal shareholders, you have internal whatever it happens to be, everybody that has a stake in this needs to know. And if it can affect your share price, and I've been in an organization years ago where bad news got out and the share price tanked very quickly, you want to make sure you have some way to get in front of that. You want to be able to tackle the threats before they have a chance to grow. And we have to work on building trust. Malcolm Gladwell has a fantastic book called Talking to Strangers. And one of the things that I talked about earlier is having this conversation with a wider audience. Not just talking amongst ourselves, which is fun, but we have to get beyond that. We have to talk to people who don't necessarily understand what security is. Because we're born into this world defaulting to trust. We're looking for food, we're looking for shelter, and most people don't get away from that. I know so many people that leave their houses open when they go to work because they don't think anybody's going to rob them. These are the kind of folks that we have to help better protect. And we have to figure out how we're going to work as one. Because we can have that brighter future. We do have the ability to get there. But there's going to be a lot of hard work. And I'll be honest, I'd like to retire someday. So a little bit of Canadiana on the way out. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you to IrisCon. Thank you to all of you for putting up with me yet again. I do really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you for that.